Hey guys, so I wanted to jump in and do a little bit of continuation of a specific section on the previous topic of what we're talking about is the riverbed concept. And so today we're going to dive in deeper in beliefs, understanding core beliefs and how those kind of come into play and are a huge part of just what makes us who we are, why we do what we do. When you start to understand some of the different layers, um, and the subconscious and how that's actually those core beliefs that have been developed, a lot of ones that we don't even know that we're operating off of, how those are actually guiding our everyday thoughts, our emotions, our actions. And I think so I it's something I'm really excited about. I'm really passionate about it. If you understand beliefs and you like start to realize how powerful they are, I mean, on one side, beliefs are something that would cause someone to give their life to save another person. And those same beliefs, or beliefs in general, but different beliefs in this case, would cause someone to take their life to kill others, right? And so understanding how our beliefs develop from development from as a young child and how we grow up, how our past experiences all come into play and really make us are who we are, and then being able to go in and kind of dissect that and determine if the beliefs that we were that maybe we modeled from our parents, or that they modeled from their parents and they modeled from their parents and they kind of been passed down, whether those are still beneficial to us, to the people around us, and to society in general in a lot of cases. So I think it's really important to first understand that we are meaning assigning machines. Like when when we come out, we're from child development going forward to like age 7, a lot of our core beliefs get established about ourselves, about the world, and then we also start to learn a lot, not only from our parents but from peers, our environment. So when if you saw that riverbed and in the previous image, and I'll pop it up here again, um, when you think about this and this huge ridge and the water, for me it provides a little context to understand that sometimes I'm trying to see someone else's perception, but it's hard for me because I have this way of thinking. I don't have the experiences that they have. I can, I'm a very empathetic person, and I can put myself in their shoes in a lot of cases, and I can try to imagine what it would have been like to go through the things that they went through, right? To I mean, if you think about some of the different communities throughout the years and some of the things that they had to endure, how that kind of continued as part of their identity going forward, all those different elements. And it's like, it's one thing to be able to dive in and empathize, which I think is a really important part, but it is never the same as actually experiencing it. And the interesting thing about that is every single individual is like that. We all have our own life experiences that make us up who we are. So none of us can really know what the other person has gone through and has experienced in the way they have. Now we can relate to different people in different ways because maybe we have similar context or similar personalities, or we've gone through similar experiences. Those all are helpful, but we don't necessarily know. I mean, why one case, two people experienced the same thing but had different outcomes, right? So there's a lot of different elements that come into play. But so I think a core concept to understand is that we're meaning making machines. When you understand that, and that's how we kind of come out, and we're constantly looking to assign meaning to things, and we have two. And so I'll give you a so I used to do this training. Gosh, it's been 20 years now. I was a sales and marketing manager for a home improvement company, and I used to do this training for our salespeople so that they better understood people, why they made the decisions they did, how to communicate effectively, all the different elements, right? And so I called it Mind Your P's and Q's. And I won't go into all the details, but the P actually had a little 3 next to it, and Q had a little S next to it. And the P3 was understand the pain pleasure principle. And basically, that's Sigmund Freud originally came up with the this pleasure principle back in the day. That is that we are constantly trying to avoid pain and move towards pleasure. Now, it gets much more nuanced than that. And the same thing you associate pain with is not the same thing I associate pain with. And we might also be, it might be different when we look at what's painful in the moment and what's painful in the future, or what's painful in the moment and what's pleasurable in the future, right? So if my vision is in the future and I'm looking at, hey, I'm going to do this thing in the future, there might be less pain for me to do this thing in the present, because I'm thinking I have this long-term goal that I'm moving towards that is helping drive me to say, you know what, I actually associate some pleasure with this, even though it's painful now. That could be exercise, right? Like someone who realizes, so it's part of it's where we're putting our attention, what the goal is, what we're trying to actually achieve, all those different elements. But in general, people are trying to move away from pain and move towards pleasure and what they associate pain and pleasure with. So it's not about what you think is painful and pleasurable, it's about what they think is painful and pleasurable, right? So when you're in that case, what I would try to do is try to uncover, using questions. And so the Q stood for questions guide our attention, and the little S was stories create impact, right? So we would utilize questions to help better understand the customer in this case. But what's interesting is it took me years and years to realize that how effective this was for yourself as an individual when you're doing your own exploration and trying to understand yourself better and trying to guide yourself better. How these are so powerful, right? Once you understand the pain pleasure principle and understand what you're associating pain and pleasure with, how to change your associations, right? And realize, like, okay, I'm associating pain with this. Why is that? And sometimes it's from a experience way in the back, and you just made a incorrect association, or you modeled it from your parents because they were like, hey, this is painful, you don't want to ever be in a relationship because there's a lot of pain there, because you saw someone go through that experience and you saw how painful that was for them. And so you have a subconscious guide that's telling you that there's pain associated with relationships, so you tend to avoid that, even though you also have a guide that's basically saying that there's pleasure there, that you want that companionship and you want that relationship. So it's really starting to understand all those different layers. And that's why I say, like, it's really interesting, because I would always tell people, like, of course I know myself, but until I really did the deep exploration and started to really understand my core beliefs, I truly didn't know myself as well as I thought I did. But once I started to understand some of these associations and that I had made in my younger years, and that was driving me today, that's really as I started to really understand myself better and go through all that. But questions guide our attention. What's really interesting about this, and this is a little bit of a cheat code for life, I would say. And I'll tell you where I made this realization. Um, I had had challenges with my weight fluctuating up and down. I'd get into good spots where I'd been consistently exercising and eating well, and then I would gain weight, and then I'd come back down, and all that stuff. And so at some point, I, I started telling myself this story, right? That little S there. I started telling myself this story is, why even do it? Because it's just going to fluctuate again, right? And so if you're telling yourself that story, that's a self-defeating behavior, right? Is like, if I continue telling myself this story of, like, why even try? Because I'm just going to gain the weight back. I'm just going to get back into this position, like, but we do that with so many different things. We have this story that's running on a loop that's telling ourselves that. That's this little doubting internal voice sometimes that's coming into play. And so one of the things I realized was we have these unconditional subconscious questions that we ask ourselves in situations. So these situational unconscious questions guide our attention in certain directions. And we've learned to basically create these questions. We've learned to basically, our subconscious basically says, hey. So I was actually in a restaurant, and I had been trying to pay more close attention to these little things that popped up to try to understand my unconscious more. And sometimes because it's hard to get into the unconscious per se, but sometimes your conscious activities, your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, the different things you're avoiding, the different things you're moving towards are all signals of what's going on underneath. And so I was trying to be more aware of just kind of what those things were. And I was sitting there looking at a menu at a restaurant, and this question surfaced in my mind of what would taste good. It seems like a simple enough question, but when you start to unpack it a little bit, I mean, what's the answer to that question? Well, what would taste good is something crunchy and salty and cheesy and melty and like all this stuff that's what would taste good is what my mind is answering that question as, right? And so is that aligned with my own vision and what I value for my health, right? What I actually see as something that's important for me. And so I started thinking about that and saying, and we use this from a business strategy perspective all the time, talking about how critical certain questions are. We have a whole business system that's just based off of asking certain questions that we've developed all the time, so that it guides our attention in the right direction, right? And so when I think about it from an individual level, I started saying, well, what is a better question, right? Because if you change the question, you change the answer to some extent, right? And so what I started asking myself is what would nourish my body, help me feel good, and reach my goals? And the answer to that is very different than the what would taste good. And so as I started getting more consistent with, just when that pattern would come up as far as what would taste good, like it'd still pop up sometimes. I would go, oh, and I would change it back to. And so the questions guide our attention, which I'm going to do a deep dive in this as we go in when we talk about the strategy phase and think about different ways that you can utilize questions to guide your attention, right? Because ultimately, it's the quantity and quality of our attention and how well that's aligned with our vision, our values, and what we find purposeful in life that determines our own life satisfaction, our quality of life, our fulfillment, our joy, all the things that we're living a life that is for us. It doesn't mean that we're living a life based on someone else's ideals, but what's truly what we value for us, right? Then we're living a life in alignment with that. And when you're living that life, it really is a great position where you don't like the outside world isn't impacting you as much, right? Because you have such an internal force, because you're already aligned from that standpoint. And so um, ultimately, if you can, so what I was saying there is if you can guide your attention more effectively, so using questions to do that, guide your attention. There's a lot of different ways to guide your attention. In the strategy phase, I'll talk about macro attention and micro attention. Macro being kind of setting the bigger vision and longer term, micro being your daily, like how are you framing and priming your attention daily to match up with the macro level, right? So, because what ultimately it's those ordinary things every single day, right, that ultimately become extraordinary. And so, a lot of times we overlook those little things. And so, part of this is taking our belief and realigning it with those little ordinary things every day. That those ordinary things every day are extremely purposeful and meaningful, right? Because then it gets us to that bigger thing, right? And so that's an important part to understand. So another component of the Q and the S is the stories create impact. So one of the things I realized when I started communicating with a lot of people was that stories were like literally 20 times more impactful in communicating an idea than just telling that idea. So I could tell you that this is the greatest security door ever, right? But if I told you a story and I basically illustrated through everything, how that security door actually helped protect and save a family in a certain case, like you're literally going to feel that in a different way. So the reason story is so powerful when communicating with another person or when communicating with yourself is that story allows us to experience things in our own way. So when you tell something someone, they have this barrier up that's saying, yeah, kind of like your bullshit meter, right? It's like coming up and it's like, okay, sure, you said that thing, that's great, but it's not connecting with the emotion. When you tell them a story, they actually internalize it. So you get behind that kind of barrier a little bit, and they start to internalize it, and they go through that process of experiencing that story, and they feel the emotion, they feel it in their own way. So it's not you communicating the details to them, it's them experiencing it, associating the emotion and connection with it in their own mind in a way that they understand. Right. So story is extremely powerful. The challenge is that the stories we tell ourselves are often negative. And when you are telling yourself negative stories all the time, you're basically continuing to reinforce these negative paths. You're basically continuing to feed that pattern, right? If we're thinking about it from a riverbed standpoint, we're basically practicing we're practicing this bad thing happening, and the more we practice something, the better we get at it, and our brain actually literally rewires and continues to keep our eyes out for that thing, right? So what you want to do, and again, we'll get into kind of tips and tactics on how to um, change some of these things and how to change stories and interrupt those patterns. I have a lot of my own little things I've used when I get into what I feel is like more of a downward spiral with a story that I'm telling myself something that's kind of negative. And why do we get there all the time? It's like sometimes we just get into that thing. We start to get into that pattern, and we're kind of doing that downward spiral, and we're telling ourselves some kind of negative story, some kind of negative outcome. We have this great frontal lobe that's awesome at predicting things. The problem is sometimes we're also looking at all these possibilities, and our reptilian brain is saying, look out for these things over here that are all the things that can hurt you. And so this is all meant for us to survive, and one of the reasons we're so good at adapting and surviving. But if you want to change from survival to actually thriving and living a life that's more in line with your vision, values, and purpose, you have to be able to be aware of those instinctual parts of yourself and what's going on with that story. So you're basically telling yourself the story. What I would do is, as that negative story was happening, I'd imagine it on a record, and that record is spinning around and around. And if you, for those of you that are younger, you know what a record is. But so you, this record, right? And you have to, if you put the needle on it, if it gets scratched at all, I can't play that story. And so what I would do is I would take that record and I would just like literally scratch it. And I would imagine having sharp nails and just scratching that record all up so it couldn't play. And then I would just toss it off. And in my mind, I would imagine it going and getting smaller and smaller and smaller until it just disappeared and was gone. And then I would ask myself a question and guide myself to, what is the outcome I actually want to see happen, and what if that happened? What kind of stories would I tell myself if this happened? And so I start guiding myself back into the direction that I'm trying to go, as opposed to the direction I'm not trying to go, right? And so there's a lot of little tips and tactics like that. We'll explore that more future, but so I want to get into a few other areas too, just to touch on. I'm going to go into a lot more depth than these, obviously, in the book. But so when we talked about the riverbed, and we talked about how that riverbed is built up of layers and layers of beliefs stacked on each other, basically these core beliefs, right? And our core beliefs are basically in our subconscious. It's not things we're directly accessing all the time. And there's a lot of core beliefs that we've developed that we're operating off of that we don't even know we're operating off of. So that's the interesting thing. And when you start to understand, when we get into the biology aspect and some of the more concrete science around this, we'll talk about the reticular activating system, how that actually plays a part, right? How you're processing all this information, but your core beliefs, right? There's other elements of you that are basically guiding your attention into this tiny little window, right? So there's some of the studies that have been done show like our subconscious, our body is taking in about 11 million bits of information per second, right? Whereas our conscious brain, somewhere between 40 and 60, and there's all these different measurements from 11 million to 40 and 40 to 60 bits, but the conscious is basically taking in like 0.01% of what's actually going on, right? And so what is guiding it to choose what's important, right? And so that's a key component. So when we look at this riverbed and we go, hey, like this is a key, this is a key thing to really realize when you start to disagree with other people, is that you only have a very small perspective. You only have a selective experience that you went through. So rather than trying to judge them because they have a different point of view, try to actually appreciate and understand like what experiences went through their life and what led them to have this belief. And what's really interesting is that what I start to notice is that a lot of times we agree, like people who disagree agree on, like, in general, like a certain outcome almost, but they disagree on how to get to that outcome. And so like we all like value, you know, our family and our friendships and health and all these things, but it's like it's actually getting to that. So rather than putting so much emotion on that, it's like try to understand and appreciate their landscape, right? Try to look at your walls and realize that you have these walls built up that's not allowing you to appreciate and understand what's going on in their world. So, um, one of the big areas, and I want to dig deep in this because I think it's probably some of the most impactful, and I'll provide you with what I think are some, for myself personally, have been some of the most impactful like belief changes that I think literally just by changing this belief, you can change your world. Now, I'll give you an example so you can kind of see what, you have a reference for what I'm talking about. But we have our core beliefs about ourselves, right? These are things that we've experienced growing up. We start building out our identity. So that's our ego. It's not a, people sometimes talk about the ego being a bad thing. The ego's not a bad thing per se. There's times when um, aspects of our ego can get in the way of things. But anyway, so we'll talk about that a little bit, and dive in there and really understand how when you have certain core beliefs, especially underlying ones that are under the surface, you're not consciously aware that these are guiding some of your thoughts, emotions, and actions. Um, then what ends up happening is that that big ridge over here where the water's coming, and then there's this big pivot, right? If you're looking at this riverbed photo, um, that's telling me that that big ridge right there, there's something underneath that, right? So when you're trying to explore, like, what maybe beliefs, experiences, associations did I create that had this, and you can start to see, hey, whenever I get in this way, my actions lead me over here, and you can kind of tell, well, there's some sort of fear, there's some sort of association over here that's causing that, and you've built up, in this case it looks like you've built up a lot of walls to protect that. And sometimes it's protecting yourself from it, right? Because you've basically either, there's like suppression or repression, like repressed like emotions and memories. They're suppressed. There's different terms as far as what those mean and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes we are literally protecting ourselves from experiencing that pain because it was so painful for us, and it could be emotionally, not physically. And often that's some of the longest lasting is the emotional, mental pain that we've done there. So there's those walls that we start to build, and often those walls, we're building those walls to protect us in certain ways, but what it's doing is it's also pushing away the thing that we often desire more, right? And so one of the things I always say is the everything you desire and everything you fear is on the other side of these walls that you've been building for years, right? So when you start to think about that, you start to realize that you have to accept the discomfort, some of the pain, some of the fear that you've been creating, and you have to kind of confront those. But as you do, you also get all these other amazing things. And so it's kind of it's a very vulnerable position to put yourself in. But that's a critical component to growth, right? Because we can't grow if we don't get out of our comfort zone. And getting out of our comfort zone means we have to get uncomfortable, meaning it's a vulnerable position to be in. And so then we can grow from there, right? So I think that's a really critical component to kind of understand and start to, because if you're down in the water with your scuba gear on and you're trying to dig through your core beliefs, there's different ways you can do that. There's definitely like um, you know hypnotism. There's definitely professional therapy. There's a lot of personal self exploration, meditation, and things that you can do. But one of the things I've found most beneficial is looking at the surface and flow of our thoughts, emotions, and actions. And when emotions get flared, when our actions get erratic or freeze, or our thoughts get really crazy, it's like that is information that's coming to you that you should take and kind of look at that and go, okay, there's likely something going on underneath the surface that I may not be aware of here. And what's often interesting is we often associate it with something that we're like, oh, I know it's this thing. And very rarely is it actually this thing that you're first think of, that, oh, they did this to me, or, X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is, right? And so it's once you start to dive into those core beliefs and start to understand those more, and core beliefs, just to reassert basically what that is, it's like anytime you're making it for yourself, it's anytime you're making like an I am statement, like, I am an athlete. I am a nice person. I am stupid. I am not worthy. I am amazing. I am smart. Whatever those things are that you are saying I am, those are core judgments, core beliefs that you are making about yourself that tend to, if you really understood someone's identity, like all their core beliefs, and you could kind of put that all together, it'd give you a very clear prediction of where they would be in the future because of those core beliefs. And so when you start to look at this landscape and start to look at where do I want to be down the road? What do I want this to look like? How do I want to cultivate this? All starts by understanding your own core beliefs and being able to change those. So another another big component is our views, our core beliefs about the world, about the way things work, about the way people work, about others, all that kind of stuff. And I'll give you an example that I think is it's a good example because our beliefs can often be barriers. And one belief, like one tiny little belief, can throw a whole wrench in everything. For a long time, when it was probably in my mid 20s to 30s, I had the belief that our basically that we as humans were pretty much set in stone by the age of 25, that we weren't going to change very much after that point. And part of that was because I read a lot and read a lot of studies on different things, and some of those things said those things, which, there was certain elements and certain studies that were done that could back up that information to some extent, that people generally didn't change that much. But it wasn't saying that people couldn't change. It was saying that often that people didn't change. Like once they got to that point, that things didn't change quite as much. Now, we now know that that's 100% not true. Like people can very much change. And there's thousands upon hundreds of thousands of anecdotal experiences where, people often have been in a position where they were forced to change. They had a life event, something experienced in their life that made them go, okay, I have to change my belief structure. I have to change the way I'm living. And unfortunately, once you start to understand, when we get into the biology aspect, this is kind of cool. Some of the connections that are made, it actually helped me a lot understanding the science behind this, the why. And what's funny is it's basically the why. We talk about that a lot. We talk about that in business. We talk about that in personal, as having a strong enough why. And you've heard that probably before, is if you have a strong enough why, you'll figure out the how. So that's 100% true. Science actually backs that up. So once you start to understand neuroplasticity, is something that there's been a lot of advancements and understanding of how the brain works, how we adapt, how our brain literally will reinforce neural connections to make things more efficient, right? And it will create new neural connections. But what is driving those things? It's having a strong enough why to drive that, right? So a lot of times that's why we see people that make drastic life changes because of some big event in their life. It's like they had a strong enough why. They were literally put in a position where they were almost to their point, they felt forced to, like, I have to do this. This is, so they had a very strong why. And so we once you learn that, you can start to go, okay, well, I don't need to wait till I am 65, 70, and I've been living a life that isn't healthy. And now I'm like, literally, like, I have a strong enough why because I have grandchildren and things like that. And I want to be around them for another 10 years or 15 years. And, there's all those kind of things, right? So once we understand that, we can actually use our prediction, our stories about the future, and we can start to create pathways that help guide us in the direction that it actually is more beneficial for us. And so imagine if someone just had that one belief that once you're age 25, you can't really change after that. Well, if you think about that, that person probably, if they were like, oh, I want to do this thing, but you can't really change after 25. So, what's the use in trying, right? That's what ends up happening when you have that belief. So you can see how powerful beliefs can be. And just one little belief that, based on inaccurate information or incomplete information, whether an assumption was made that people can't change after 25, as opposed to it being that people tended to not change that much. Um, but part of that was because there was that opinion there. So once you start to understand how our belief, all of a sudden, once people hit that 4-minute mile, everyone started breaking it, right? So now that we understand that, oh, you can change and you can change greatly. And here's all these examples of people who've literally done that throughout their lives, who've changed careers, who've changed like habits, who've gone from one kind of life to another kind of life. There's so much information that supports that, obviously. And then once you look at the biology, which we'll dive into that specific aspect of like neuroplasticity, because I think it's such a critical component, then you really start to understand how a belief can either be a roadblock in life, right, or it can be a ramp, kind of getting you to a new level. And so sometimes the way I like to think about a belief is like a tabletop, right? So if you have a table with only one leg, it's not a very strong table, right? It's going to fall over. So our beliefs are very much similar in this way, in that um, each of those legs of that table would be like supporting beliefs, supporting experiences, supporting associations and perceptions, all these different representations that you've created. It's important to be aware that once you kind of have a strong belief, you naturally look for supporting information to support that belief. So that can be very powerful, but that can also promote bias. And so it can promote not seeing the whole picture. So once you start to understand that, it's both a superpower because, like, when you create empowering beliefs, all of a sudden your mind starts finding more of those empowering things to build those associations and help you reach that said thing, right? Or reinforce that belief. So I think it's from that standpoint, once you start to understand, like, okay, I created this belief, and I'll think of, I'll use one for myself that was, um, it was life changing for me to uncover this, and then to literally, like, break down that old limiting belief, that old belief that was really not serving me and others, and was causing me a lot of pain and frustration. And I didn't even know. Like, and honestly, if you would have asked me, I'd say 5, 6 years ago, if you would have asked me if my self worth was in any way based on like my ability to be a good provider and like financially, like be a good provider financially, and just be a good like business person, growing a business and be successful and all that kind of stuff, I would have said, well, no, like it's not at all. Like my self worth isn't based on that. Um, but as I started to dive deeper, I started to uncover that, I did have very strong beliefs. And what was interesting was it was one of those things where it was kind of like, as I'm going through different kind of processes and things like that, I'd feel like this thing surface where it was like this thought would come to mind where it was like, oh, well, you can't do that because then you like, you would be a bad provider. Like you wouldn't do that, and you would then not be worthy. And what wouldn't you be worthy of? You wouldn't be worthy of love. Like you wouldn't be worthy of that respect, that love, that what you truly desire. And what if you break down most of our fears, it comes back to being not worthy of love, not worthy of, and there's many different forms of love. It could be more attention or significance kind of based, or it could be just love from another person or companionship. There's a lot of different things there. And so when you look at that and you go, okay, hey, there's this belief, and it's like I can find tons and tons of legs that support that, right? Because our society as a whole, um, and more so these days, it's a pressure across everyone. But historically, it's been more of a pressure that's been focused mainly on men. And really, part of being a man was the society kind of put as part of being a man was being a good provider. And so, there was a lot of pressure for men who decided to stay at home and raise their children, which, it still hurts me to this day that there's so much of that where it's like people don't understand, their beliefs and all that kind of stuff. And then they someone over here who's like doing this great thing who's like, hey, I'm going to be a stay-at-home dad and raise my kids and want to do that stuff. And so there's all kinds of biases around that, right? So there's tons of legs I can find to support that just from what society imprints on us, right? That you need to be a good provider, and especially for coming from what a good man in that case, right? What beliefs and biases are around like a gender and what that person's role should be in life, right? And so I grew up, you know, 75 to 80s and things like that. So there was quite a bit of that still in both media and all these things. So there's literally tons of associations where I saw, this man, and there was times I look back and go, you know what? I had times where it was like had my heart broken, and in my mind I was like, I'm going to, I built that wall up to say, hey, like I can do this. And then I also started creating that association of I'm going to become successful and worthy so that I am wanted and desired, right? And what's funny is like saying that out loud, I get that people might find that embarrassing, but I think it's so crystallizing. And I think so many other people have very similar subconscious beliefs that have been guiding them. And what's crazy is I can also realize that that served me in a lot of ways, right? So there's this little bit of there's all everything's kind of on a spectrum to some extent, right? And there's a little bit of that conundrum of um, a drive and coming from a place of um, I don't want to call it a dark place per se, but like coming from more of fear, which was my fear of not being enough, and like I'm going to show you, like I'm going to do this, which comes from a bad intention. So ultimately, I don't think um, it's a good component. What I think a lot of people think is that they having that serves them in a way that will help them get to that because it drives them. The problem is you often end up to that point and you are unfulfilled because you've believed that once I get to this point, I'll be worthy of these things, but that's not truly what. So what's crazy is that it's been within you the whole entire time. That's the only place that we are literally going to find that is not outside of ourselves. We're only going to be able to find that inside ourselves. So once you start to make that connection, it's kind of scary, but it's also extremely empowering, because how many people out there that did all this work, got to this point, and build all this stuff up to be this successful person, but they never find love. They're constantly actually still fearful of being with someone. They think someone's always after their money, and they can't be afraid. They can't be trusted, right? There's that point. And there's a lot of people who they're never satisfied because it's like they did that one thing and now the next thing. Now, that's not to say that there's a lot of people that aren't successful that also are happy and fulfilled and not driven by the other sides, but it doesn't matter. What is a great thing to realize is that it doesn't, that component doesn't determine, it's not the determining factor of whether, you know, you are worthy of those things. That's just an internal element that you control and have control over. Once you start to gain more agency, start to gain more self-awareness and how we work. So the core beliefs, understanding some of those components and how they're guiding your thoughts, emotions, and actions every day, things from societal level, things from, growing up with your parents in the community that you were in the whatever labels and groups that you took on at different times, and how that forms your identity, and why when someone says something that is counter to what you think, it feels like an attack. Like you get very angry. It's because it feels like an attack on who you are, your identity, because you associate your identity with said thing, right? Said idea, said belief, whatever that is. And so it's really important to understand that your self-worth isn't based on any of that, and that once you can get to the point, the way I look at it is I want to be my best. And it's rarely can I be my best when I'm letting those things outside of me control my state to an extent that I am often reacting in a way that is not beneficial. So I want to be my best. And so I want to get better at guiding my own attention, my state, my beliefs, my biology in a way where I can be my best and show up in my best way possible for my team, right? Our clients, for my family, for my wife, for my friends, for the community, right? And so when I'm thinking about it from that aspect, it's like understanding, then you're no longer measuring your beliefs in just what is beneficial for me, which I think that's a good place to start. But I think as you try to reach other areas, you start to think about your beliefs and how those are beneficial not only for you but for your family and your coworkers and your community, and how that kind of comes into play. And then you're choosing your beliefs and you're building those beliefs in a way that supports all those things, that creates a better environment for yourself and others, that comes from an intention, not like the state. You're coming from a place not of fear and of scarcity, um, but coming from a place of love and abundance. And when you do that, what's insane, what happened for me was I went from a place of extreme stress. There's a number of other little beliefs, and I'll share one of those with you about problems or challenges, and how I changed my belief around that, and it literally changed my stress. Um, but I think once you start to guide those in a way that is um, beneficial for the way you want to experience life and impact others, then it has a huge impact. Because for me, I went from being extremely stressed to being having experiencing so much less stress, and actually all of a sudden the abundance in my life, whether it was friendships, whether it was relationship with my wife or my children or my team, whether it was financial abundance, whether it was health, like all those things started just growing and improving in ways that I had always wanted and hoped for. But my fear, usually when I was over on the fear stress side, I was less effective and less efficient at doing everything because I was constantly being bounced around by the thing that was guiding me from a fear and scarcity standpoint. And so I was letting other things fall by the wayside. And so what happened is, as I started to experience less of that, I started to actually grow and get better, become a better leader, which helped me be more effective at leading other people and be more effective in the business. I became a better husband. At least I believe so. I became a better friend and a better father and all those things. And so, um, but I wanted to tie back real quick to changing our beliefs around challenges. So this is one of those things where I say, like, the way you experience life is often because of your beliefs. So you have a problem. Say I'll give you an example that used to cause me a lot of stress. Was if we ever had a client that was upset, right? So we're a large agency. This is it tells you right away it's a disaster. It's a just a bad way to be. But as you grow larger and larger, if that's your belief set, you basically are going to get more stressed and stressed, because as you grow larger and larger, you're the law of numbers is there's going to eventually be someone who's upset because there's either a misunderstanding or something whatever it is, right? So what I saw there was basically that stress. Like, if there was a client that was upset with something, whatever it was, and it doesn't even have to be something that was like our fault or whatever it was, maybe they had a misunderstanding, it doesn't matter, but they're upset. Like, I took that stress on because what I was doing was I was tying that to, ultimately, which is hard to think about this like just from one step to another, but once you start to connect things, I would go, okay, like, oh, we might lose this client, right? That's where my mind would go, okay, we don't want to lose this client. Well, what would that mean if we lost this client? Well, that would mean that, oh gosh, we might have to downsize, we might have to, like, cut back on in different areas. What would that mean? Oh, you'd lose team members, that would affect morale. Like, in your mind starts spiraling and all these different things. And then ultimately, if you keep looking down of the, well, why would that actually bother, why would this, why would that, it ultimately comes back to um it's threatening your self-worth in some way or another. And so there's two things that I'd say there. One is coming to the point of realizing that your self worth is unconditional, on, like, just an intrinsic self worth that is not conditional on anything outside of you, right? Um, that creates a much better space to be effective from, and it also creates a much better feeling. You have less stress, all these things, and what was going on in my mind a lot of times is, like, that stress was serving me, because then I was being more proactive, making sure, everyone was doing what they needed to do to make sure this client was happy and all that kind of stuff, right? So that was a what was actually happening was I would take my stress and then I would be passing that stress on to the rest of the team, which is horrible. And it doesn't serve the client in the end. It doesn't serve them at all. Um, in fact, it's a detriment to them. And once you start to understand the inner workings of an individual and the inner workings of an organization, then you start to understand, well, why that's actually a detriment. Um, and so there's a couple different reasons. I'm not going to get into that now, though. But once I started to look at that, and I started going, you know what? A every One of the beliefs I realized is that every challenge, everything that I've ever faced in some way or another, has given me insights, has given me information, has given me experiences that have helped me grow and become better. And what is consistent is that usually when I'm in the experience, it is very hard to have the foresight to go, this is going to benefit me in some way in the future, right? By the time I almost lost my home because I couldn't pay the mortgage. It was like getting near Christmas and all that kind of stuff. Like that was like one of my lowest times ever. But looking back on it, had I not been put in that position, I probably wouldn't have gone, okay, I have to figure out a way to make this work. And I figured out and got someone to rent the house, and I moved into a small room with a friend of mine, right? Like, so that I could make that work. And I had a, young daughter at the time and all that kind of stuff. So it was, um, but had I not done that, I would have never probably learned how to rent out a house. And then when I got back on my feet and got into a better position about another house, then I moved, and another house, I rented out that house, right? So it's, once I start to look and connect the dots, it's easy to connect the dots going backwards. And what's interesting is like, well, what I could do is, what this is kind of the way I looked at it, is what I could do is, rather than looking at each of these challenges or issues or problems or whatever come up, if I looked at them as like, you know what, I know something great's going to come out of this, and I know with a very high level of certainty that if I can actually be in a better state, if I don't let it influence me and get me into a negative state where I'm actually stressed myself, causing stress to my family, to other people, because I'm stressed because of this situation. I know if I'm in a good state, I can actually serve the client better. I can serve our team better, so that we can better understand, oh, and a lot of times it's like, oh, well, there was a misunderstanding. They thought X, Y, and Z. And so, like, there's been so many times where it's just like a simple misunderstanding. And it's like, okay, we're able to address that. We're actually, now I realize and look at it as part of my job is to make sure that I am reducing the stress on the team, that I'm actually encouraging them to make mistakes. And so I won't get into all the elements of that, but it's like, I don't want to, if we punish mistakes, we punish innovation. Like, so you don't want to punish innovation, right? So same thing as an individual. If when you make a mistake as an individual, you're super hard on yourself, you're not being compassionate and realizing like, hey, that's part of growing. Like, we're never going to grow and innovate and get better if we don't allow for mistakes to happen. Now, that doesn't mean that if you make the same mistake over and over and over, you don't want to correct that, right? That just means that you made a mistake. Okay, cool. In the name of innovation, you're working to improve it. What was it? How can we improve it going forward? But not putting a lot of stress and pressure on that. Same as an individual. It's like, okay, what can I learn from that? And how can I not make the mistake again, so that I have a growth mindset, as opposed to, I'm going to constantly punish myself every time I make a mistake, or I'm going to constantly punish, people every time they make a mistake. Well, that's going to make it so that no one is willing to do anything. They're not willing to stick their neck out there. They're not willing to take risks and innovate and grow. So, so changing that belief from that now when I have a challenge that pops up, I actually ask myself, like, what amazing is going to come from this? Like, there's going to be something great at some point in the future, and it's hard for me to see now, but like, I could see a bunch of great things happening from this. And then I just look at, and rather than going like, it doesn't mean that I'm ignoring that there are negative aspects of something happening. Say we have a team member that leaves or something like that we have to find someone to bring into that role, and what that means, and all those different aspects, right? So that doesn't mean that I'm being blind to some of the challenges. It means that what I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm in my best position to help facilitate, solutions, as opposed to letting the outside world dictate my state, dictate how I'm going to react. Instead of, I'm going to be in a state where I can look at it and respond in a way that's the most effective. So um, that was a huge belief shift for me that changed my stress. And when I actually got to that point, I was able to change where I was coming from, because I was coming from before a position of fear and scarcity. I was worried, and now I'm coming from a position of love and abundance. And so when there's something there, it's not losing. It's like, okay, there's an opportunity for growth here. I'm not losing anything. In fact, we can probably, in most cases, if someone's upset about something, if you handle it in a way that's more effective, you actually can strengthen that relationship, right? So coming from a really good place and making sure you're coming from a place of love and abundance and really understanding, as opposed to feeling attacked where you're defending yourself and all that kind of stuff. You're coming from a place of just realizing like, hey, they had this perspective and understanding. And, while there was a miscommunication on something and totally there, like we need to understand where they were, empathize with it. And if we can, correct and make adjustments, but also be clear with them. Like, that's the great thing about, from our business side, our team side, is we are very much about like, it's a relationship, right? Like, we work with the client. We're a partner with our clients. And so, we're on equal footing. And so we want them to know that like, we're here to partner with them long term. And we are going to treat them with the utmost respect and care and expertise and everything we do. And we expect the same, right? And so it's that kind of thing where it's like, okay, cool. And sometimes there's not a client fit because either they're not at a place where they're mature enough in their operations to treat people with respect. Unfortunately, there's a lot of times business owners, which I empathize with, um, have been rewarded for being in that state of consistent anger, consistent like, like, you do this, and it's a tough place to be in for them personally, for everyone else. I've been in some of those states myself, so I completely understand. But at just the point we're at, as far as a maturity level as a business, we just won't. I won't allow our team to be treated in a way that's where there's a lot of anger being directed at them for no appropriate reason. Obviously, if they did something, then that's a different story. But there's some people that kind of get to that state, right? And that's just where they live, and that just means it's not a good fit for us, right? So, but what's really cool is we've gotten really good at working with people and understanding people more effectively. So it's one of the key components to building and developing and growing a company. One of the number one things is people. And so that's where we kind of shine as an organization, is taking that to the next level, when it's like we have all the expertise and skill sets in all the different areas, but it's like you work with a large organization. You have to really understand people in order to be effective and get things done. So, um, we talked about core beliefs. We talked about some of the different ways that like a belief can basically derail you, or it can be a ramp, from that standpoint. Um, Talked about the P's and Q's, the pain pleasure principle, how questions guide our attention and stories create impact. Give you a little bit of a kind of some tips and tricks around how to disrupt some of the patterns if you get into those downward spirals, like by scratching the record and throwing it off. There's a number of different visualization techniques that you can do, and it sounds funny, it sounds weird, but it is so effective. It's crazy, and that's really what I lean towards. Is you won't hear me talk about positive thinking too much. What you'll hear me talk about is beneficial thinking. And I understand the benefits of negative. I understand the benefits of positive. What I'm looking for is what is effective and beneficial at the end of the day. Not that positive thinking is bad, because it's not. Positive thinking is amazing. Our brain is biased towards negativity. It's biased towards survival. If you think about from an evolutionary standpoint where we started and where we are now, uh, we were designed to stay alive. So we are always looking out for um, what could hurt us, what could take from us, what could end our lives, right? What could take our food, all that kind of stuff. So we have some of that scarcity fear built into us. And so it's really about being aware of those instinctual things and overcoming that and becoming more conscious of those patterns that are underlying. And so, um, I'm super excited to dive into this more. I may do another episode just on beliefs. When we get into the strategy phase, I'll really talk about more about how creating new beliefs become a part of creating those new patterns. Because a lot of times what we're doing is we are trying to change our actions, right? When we think about habits, we usually think about habits of action. We don't think about habits of thoughts, of habits of emotion, our beliefs, or those other patterns that all come into play. And what those are all being guided by is those core beliefs underneath your own physiology, your own biology and state, all those different elements. So once you can understand those, you can start to create new, um, better supporting environments internally and externally. There's things you can do in your own environment to have that be more effective as well. But I think for now, I'll sign off and want to thank everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the Give, Grow, and Be Grateful podcast, and look forward to chatting with you more soon.